you to this Wednesday night service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. I want to talk to you tonight about the newest virus that's going around. Oh yes, there's another one. But this one is not COVID related. In fact, it's unrelated to any virus that you know about anywhere, because this virus seems to affect people who attend church more than it does those out in the general population. That's because this virus is not a physical malady at all. It is an entirely spiritual malady, and I call it the Cain Syndrome. One of the first signs that you have it is when your wife begins to ask you a series of questions. She says, "Jack, what's the matter with you? Jack, why are you always on edge? Jack, why are you mad all the time? Jack, why are you always snapping at me and the kids?" Does that sound familiar? What's the matter with Jack? Is it stress? Or is it nerves that makes him angry and sad all the time? Or is it something deeper and more sinister? The Bible says that you can be angry and sin not. But there's also an anger that is infectious and dangerous. Like an infection, it spreads, touching every area of your life. It's a seething anger. It's always just under the surface. If it was water in a pot, it would be steaming, ready to erupt into a boil. So why is Jack like that? Well, Jack has Cain Syndrome. He hasn't yet discovered that his relationship with God has a practical impact on his everyday life. Is it possible that the way you feel emotionally and the way you relate to other people has a connection to your own relationship with God? Let me introduce you to another guy. His name is Joe, and Joe also has Cain Syndrome. Here's how the symptoms manifest themselves in Joe's life. And as you listen to this list of Joe's symptoms, compare them against what's going on in your life right now. Joe is generally unhappy with his whole life. His marriage is miserable. His job is miserable. His kids are miserable. He is miserable. Everybody in Joe's life is in danger of being contaminated by the contagion of Joe's misery. His doctor put him on medication for it. But for Joe, at least, the meds haven't helped. Do you know why? It's because Joe's problem is not physical at all. It's a spiritual problem. And that spiritual problem is having a negative impact on Joe's whole life. He doesn't have to be miserable, and neither does everybody around him. Where can these guys get help? What doctor can they consult for answers? Well, to find out, we need to go back to the book of Genesis. For in the book of Genesis, we find Jack and Joe embodied in another character called Cain. You know his story. It comes from Genesis chapter 4. We meet Cain in Genesis chapter 4 in the middle of verse 2, where the Bible says, "Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." These two brothers, and right away we notice a marked difference in their lifestyle. They each held different jobs. But Cain's problem was not at all job related. In fact, there is no shame in the job that Cain held after Adam and Eve sinned. Cain's job became vital to the function of the family. Both of these brothers worked hard to survive. The issues at hand in Cain's life that we're going to see had nothing to do with his job or how they worked. Look at chapter 4, beginning to read in verse 3 again and to verse 5. "So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the first fruit of the ground. And Abel, on his part, also brought the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. If you read these verses and you read no further, you will begin to think that the root of Cain's problem was in God's failure to accept his offering. Please understand that when Adam sinned, that sin put a distance between him and God that God never intended. That distance is what plays a part in this story. Cain's heart was distant from God, but God had no desire to be distant from Cain. Yet even Cain's sacrifice revealed a heart that was distant from God. If we continue to read, the Bible says, it tells us in another book, but it tells us a little more about the story. In the book of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice to God than Cain. Apparently, Cain had issues with giving God anything at all, and so he gave God less than his best. His offering spoke volumes about the condition of the heart that gave it. You see, God looks at more than what you and I drop into the offering plate. He looks at our hearts. He looks at our motives. What sanctifies an offering in the eyes of God is not the size of that offering or the item that is offered, but the heart that offers it. So on this occasion, there was something about Cain's heart that wasn't right with God. You see, when a person has no regard for God by what he gives or how he lives, the distance between God and that person becomes greater and greater, and soon that person will begin to exhibit all the characteristics of this malady that we call Cain Syndrome. Verse 5 again, the latter part of verse 5. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. There it is. A seething anger began to crawl under the surface of Cain's skin. Despondency was written all over his face, and it was all directly related to his walk with God. Unfortunately, because things weren't right in Cain's walk with God, then things weren't right in Cain's walk with Abel, his brother. Like Joe and Jack, Cain was angry and miserable, and he was looking for somebody to blame other than himself. In chapter 4, verse 6, this is what the Lord said. Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? Could the Lord be asking you that same question today? Boy, I've heard him ask it to me before. What about you? What do you attribute to the anger that rumbles under the surface of your skin? Why are you so miserable? Who is to blame? Who did you point the finger at today, and whose fault will it be tomorrow? And who will be the next victim of your anger? God gave Cain no time to point fingers. Instead, God identified Cain's problem. Cain's face began to bear the expression of a heart that was not right with God. Cain had a spiritual problem. He was discouraged because he was out of fellowship with God. Cain was miserable. Cain was angry. Cain was sad. And it was all because he couldn't find it in his own heart to humble himself before God. So what about you? Why are you angry? Why are you discouraged? Who's to blame? Is it your wife? Is it your boss? Is it the kids? Or could it be that the misery that surges through you is a direct result of being out of fellowship with God? You have Cain Syndrome. God told Cain a little later, and we're going to read the verse, that if he would do what was right, then things would change in his own heart and in his life. In fact, here it is in verse 7, chapter 4 of Genesis. The Lord said, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And then God gave Cain this sober warning, and it's a warning that you and I need to hear today. Because anytime that you are disobedient to God, you are toying with disaster. This is what the Lord said to Cain in the second part of Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Disobedience to God is sin, and the temptation to be disobedient is like a lion lying right outside your door, ready to pounce on you at any moment. You have to resist that temptation at all costs. You have to beat back that temptation like it's a vicious, wild beast ready to eat you up. You can't go on stepping outside the boundaries that God has set for you. To do so is to endanger not only your life, but the lives of all those around you. Because you see, this malady that you have, this Cain Syndrome, will begin to infect, infest, and disintegrate every relationship that you have. You might remember that in 2003, there was this couple of magicians. Their name was Siegfried and Roy. Some of you will remember them clearly. And they were performing before a live audience in Las Vegas. And they prided themselves on their ability to handle two royal white tigers that were a part of their show. But on October the 3rd, 2003, one of those 600-pound white tigers decided to act in accordance with exactly what it was, a killing machine. It pounced on its owner, grabbing him by the neck and dragging him off stage as a stunned audience watched. You can toy with sin, you can flirt with it, you can play with it as if it is harmless, but the day will come when it will reveal itself for exactly what it is, and it will leave your life and those around you devastated. God told Cain, it's up to you to master it. You must remember what it is that threatens your life and what it can do both to you and to your family. Adam and Eve had only recently learned that their physical health depended on their relationship with God. God warned them that the soul that sinned would die. And when Adam and Eve sinned, it impacted not only their lives, but also the lives of their children. Your walk with God, or the lack of it, will have an impact on your physical and mental health. But it'll not only have an impact on you, it will have an impact on your family. If Cain Syndrome infects your life, it will spread to everyone around you. Watch how Cain's broken relationship with God impacted his relationship with his brother. In Genesis chapter 4, the first part of verse 8, we read simply, and Cain told his brother. Cain apparently told his brother about this conversation that he had with God. Cain told Abel how God told him that sin would get the best of him and everyone around him if he didn't master it, if he didn't beat it back to where it belonged. Cain remembered what God said, but he was not obedient. God promised him, he said, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? Won't things change in your life? Won't you feel lighter and better, and won't that show up in your face? But Cain didn't do well. He never adjusted his attitude, the attitude of his heart toward God, and his life continued to be infected with a seething anger and a deep discouragement that weighed heavy on his mind. He refused to fight the lion that threatened his life and the life of his family, and then one day, that smoldering anger that was under the surface of his skin erupted. And the Bible says, and it came about when Cain and Abel were in the field, that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. What caused that to happen? Was it stress or was it sin? Was it depression or was it distance from God? The lion of sin had pounced upon Cain, and as a result, Abel was dead. When you allow sin to lay its grip upon your life, it will not only hurt you, it will inevitably hurt everyone around you. Jesus said that when the tempter comes, he comes only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. Sin lay at the door of Cain's heart and life. And when he opened that door, that ravenous beast rushed in with all its fury and began to destroy Cain's relationship with God and Cain's relationship with his brother. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain tried to hide his sin with lies and arrogance, but he couldn't hide it. He couldn't hide what was in his heart, and he couldn't hide what was in the ground. Listen to what the Bible says in Genesis 4:10. And God said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." I have heard many men deal with that question in the aftermath of some family tragedy caused by their own sin. It's only after having been seduced by sin and having lost their wife and their children that men will mournfully cry, "Oh, what have I done?" Some of you listening need to cry out to God tonight and say, "Oh, what am I doing? Let me turn around and turn back to God right now before I hurt my family and lose all that God has given me." But Cain made no such turn. And as a result, this is what God said in Genesis chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you, and you shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on earth." There was a cure for Cain's sin. There was a cure for Cain's despondency, but there was no cure for Abel's death. God can remedy your feelings. Obedience to his voice will lift your spirits and your countenance. But if you refuse to listen to him and allow sin to continue its course in your life, some other life will be destroyed for which there will be no remedy. The sin that crouches at the door of your life, if unmastered, will destroy those you love and those you cherish. You know what Cain needed? He needed a vision of his own heart, and so do you. One of the most powerful stories I ever heard on the nature of the human heart was told by Malcolm Muggeridge. Working as a journalist in India, he left his residence one evening to go to a nearby river for a swim. And as he entered the water across the river, he saw an Indian woman from a nearby village who had come to have her bath. And Muggeridge impulsively felt the allurement of the moment, and temptation stormed into his mind. He had lived with this kind of struggle for some years, but somehow fought it off in honor to keep his commitment to his wife, Kitty. But on this occasion, he was ready to step over the line of marital fidelity, and he struggled for a moment, and then he began swimming furiously toward that woman, literally trying to outdistance his own conscience. And as he swam, his mind fed the fantasy that stolen waters would be sweet, and he just swam the harder for it. He was just 2 or 3 feet away from this woman when he emerged from the water, and any emotion that might have gripped him, he said, paled into insignificance with the devastation that shattered him when he looked at her. These are his words. He said, "She was old and hideous, and her skin was wrinkled, and worst of all, she was a leper. This creature grinned at me, showing a toothless mask. That experience left him trembling and muttering under his breath, 'What a dirty and hideous woman.' But then the rude shock of it all dawned upon his heart. It was not the woman who was dirty and hideous. It was his own heart." Cain came to such a rude awakening. And Cain said in Genesis 4, verses 13 and 14, "My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and I shall be hidden, and I shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. And it will come about that whoever finds me will kill me." You see, Cain finally realized the condition of his own heart before God, but only after it had destroyed his brother's life and his parents' hearts. How far will you follow after sin? How fast will you swim after it? And what will you find when you lay hold of it? Will you find that what looked beautiful, when you grasp it, instead will be hideously repulsive, like your own sinful heart? The Bible says in Genesis 4:16, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod." That's the land of wandering, east of Eden. The blessing of God will fall upon your obedience. The curse of God will fall upon your disobedience. The Lord's face will be hidden from you. And like Cain, you will spend the rest of your life wandering in search of the peace and contentment that could have been yours in the presence of the Lord. Some of you listening are suffering from Cain Syndrome. You are angry and sad and terribly miserable in your life. You point fingers of blame to everyone around you, but the problem is in your own heart. You're suffering from Cain Syndrome. It has infected your life. And if you're not careful, it's going to infect the lives of everyone around you. And it will end up hurting your family in ways that you will never be able to remedy. Is there a sin you need to forsake? Is there an adjustment that you need to make? Do that for the sake of your family right now. Thank you so much for listening.